Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 63, Create an Inline Editing Control. Why open a document when you can just edit it? Okay, I'm pretty happy to have a special guest contributor coming back, and that's none other than Tim Tripcony, who's coming on to actually do two shows. And Tim is a developer from GBS. His title is XMage, and he's done another show for Notes9 a little while ago about using themes to control your form layout and stuff like that. And that's his information here. And what he's going to do is he's going to do a two-part series. And the first part is he's going to build a custom control. And that's all this video is going to be. So it's for anybody, and it's how to do inline editing on your page. Then the next part is which is gonna be a little more advanced, is he's going to convert that to a library component, and we'll talk about that more on the next show. So with that being said, let's go right to the demo.
Hello, this is the first in a two-part series. In this first part, we will be demoing how you can create an inline edit interface for your data in XPages. So here we're looking at a very basic contact manager application, and the primary interface is just a list of contacts, and it's somewhat representative of what you might have if you use the standard view panel, but as you will see momentarily, we're using a repeat control instead. What distinguishes this from most interfaces of this type is that I can do this in here and it'll present an inline edit interface for me. But depending on which field or which column I double click, that determines which will be focused. So I can edit data here, and I can click the check mark, and then it's saved. And if we reload the page, then we'll see that it did in fact save the changes. Whereas if I edit this again, and then click the cancel button instead, then it reverts to what I had before. So how do we actually do this? First, let's take a look at the XPage itself. So in this case, I'm just binding to a domino view, and then inside my main layout, because I'm using the application layout component, first I create a repeat control where I'm just assigning a value that is an array of field names. And so inside that, I'm just going to have a text field that is bound to whichever field label it's iterating. So if, for example, I wanted to also have, say, email show up, then I could just add a new column label or field label. And if I reload the quote, then we have a second repeat control. And this is where it gets a little fancy. So in this case, I'm just binding to the var of my domino view data source. And so what that essentially means is that the repeat control is going to iterate through the view entry collection that represents all the. In this repeat, I've got a panel, and since panels can contain their own data sources, I've defined a domino document data source, var of contact, and ironically, we're going to set it to be editing the document, even though when initially the page loads, it looks like it's in read mode, but you'll see why momentarily. Specify form name of contact, and then here's the key, is binding the document ID to the note ID of whatever the contact entry is. So again, by binding a repeat to a view, we're getting all the view entries of that view. So our bar is contact entry, and each view entry has a note ID So now within this repeat, we've got a separate domino document data source for every document that corresponds to a view entry in the view. And then finally we set the ignore request params property to true, because whenever we're setting multiple data sources on the same XPage, it's a good idea to set this value to true so that it's not looking at the URL request parameters to determine what its document ID should be bound to, for example. And then next we have this OpenNTF inline editor control. So let's take a look at this. This is just a custom control within this same database. So the first thing that we're going to do on this is we set a computed field and immediately force it to never show up, rendered equals false. And its value is just bound to a Boolean. It's just set to true. But we're calling this isRead-only because it gives us a component that isn't bound to any data, so it's never going to get written back to any documents. But it's just an easy placeholder for other components to reference to bind some of their own properties, which you'll see in a moment. So then we define a span that inside it has a repeat. Now, what we're binding this to is compositeData.fieldName. So what that refers to is we've defined on this custom control that it can accept a property of field name, it's a type string, and it can contain multiple values. So on the XPage itself, when we're defining this custom control reference, we're specifying this dot field name is equal to, and then I pass in first name and last name. So what that ends up with is that this custom control is passed a list of field names, and that's why that's a valid value for this repeat control to be bound to. So compositeData.fieldName will be a list of the field names it has been passed, and so it will repeat this content no matter how many times a field name is encountered. So just like on the XPage, I could add a value to this array, and I got a new column over here. If I copy this and paste in a new one and say I want it to be bound to an email field, now when I reload the page, these documents contain that. There's no data. But if I edit a record, now I have a new field, and I can type in an email address. And if I reload the page, so theoretically you could add this as many times as you want, and you would just keep getting new columns on the page. So let's take a look at what's actually getting iterated for each of these columns. So we've got a span for a field container, and then just basic input text. In addition to the field names that are passed in, we can be iterated. And we're probably used to seeing field values bound to data source dot field name. But in this case, we don't know what field name will be passed in. So instead of treating the field name as a property of the data source, we want to treat it as sort of an associative array. So whatever data source is being passed, instead of then having a dot in the field name, we've got the brackets, so it says whatever the field name is, bind it to that field on this data source. And then here's how we toggle the read-only. For each field that it's repeating, we bind its read-only property to the Boolean value of this hidden computed text. So if this changes from true to false, then this field is no longer read-only. And then finally, we define an on-double-click event. So here's where we actually set the value back to false. So if I double-click on this field, then it's going to set this read-only component's value to false. Since the read-only of the field we just double-clicked is bound to that, the read-only is now also going to evaluate to false, therefore the field is editable. And a couple things about this event handler. It's of course a partial refresh, so we don't reload the whole page. It's on complete, looks at whatever it evaluates what the client ID is of the current field, and finds it using the dojo.byId, in this client script of course, and calls focus. So that's why if we double click on the first name, then when it sets them all to editable, it focuses the first name. If we double click the last name, it focuses the last name instead. And the one odd thing about this is that we're also defining a client-side event in addition to the server-side action. The client script returns a Boolean expression of whether the event target, what we double-clicked, was a span or not. So essentially what this means is that if this field is read-only, which it is initially, then instead of being an HTML input, it's sent as an HTML span. So basically what this means is this double-click event only fires if the field is read-only. If we've already double-clicked on the field and it's editable, then if they happen to double-click again to say, select the field, then it's not going to refire the event again and steal their focus. So that's really all that's going on for setting it to editable. So now let's look at the buttons for save and cancel, because there's a couple interesting things going on here. So first we've got our confirmation button, the green check mark. And so we suppress the rendering of this if the fields are read-only, of course. And then we've got an on-click event handler for this image. And so this does is it tries to save whatever data source was passed in. And of course save returns a Boolean. True if it was successful, false otherwise. So if we were able to successfully save, then we set that read-only component's value back to true. So now any fields that are bound to that, they're read-only again. Our second image is the cancel button. So this has the opposite rendered, the same rendered attribute. Just like the check mark doesn't show up till the fields are editable, the cancel button doesn't also. But all this does is it toggles the read-only component's value back to true. So it does the same thing as the save button without the save. You might be wondering, how come it doesn't retain the data even though it's not saving it? Because we might not actually be writing it back to disk, but we're still posting it back to the field value. So it should retain that, right? Well, the way we get around that, and what makes this a true cancel button, is in addition to specifying that this is a partial refresh event, we also specify that it has a partial exec mode, which means that it will only process whatever component matches this exec ID and its children. But the exec ID of this event is the ID of this event, meaning that it will run the event, and any components where the event explicitly changes component properties. So in this case, we're getting a handle on the isReadOnly component, and we're explicitly setting a local value of one of its properties. That's going to stay. Anything else that changed in the component tree during this event gets ignored entirely because it's posting the data and the fields are going to retain that data. That would still perform better than an exec mode that's full. But in this case, we want it to be a cancel button. So we set the exec ID to be the same ID as the event itself. So it only processes the event. It doesn't process any other components. So hopefully that little bit of trickery is interesting to you. Obviously, this event is going to perform better than most because it's partial, but it also gives us a handy way to manipulate specific component values without some of the follow-on effect that we typically have with standard events.
And that's the demo. If you have any questions for me, my contact information is here, and I thank you for your time.